In part 2 of this presentation, we're going to look in more detail at some issues that arise with the study of private events as they relate to self-observation. This image is only one of many ways that could be used to characterize the act of self-observation. Now, within the realms of science fiction, it looks entirely feasible to be able to use a device like this. But this is a deceptive image, and it was designed to provoke discussion in response to this question. Would you be able to see yourself if you looked through the eyepiece? If you are tempted to answer by saying, "Of course I would," then I'm afraid you'll have to think again. Your answer assumes that using this device would be like looking into a mirror in the way that you normally do. But it wouldn't be like that. In fact, this is what you would see. You would see a vast forest of neuronal networks. There would be no you hiding amongst these neurons, no smiling you that you would recognize. What you would see is a different kind of reflection, a different image of you. There would be no inner you, separate from the biological system that is you. This is also you. And what you see here in your physical architecture is the legacy of your genetic inheritance. Amazing, really. But it's not the you whom you expected to see. Earlier, we looked at images of the behavioral stream to help portray the process of change over time. Graham Lawton, in New Scientist magazine in July 2011, describes some of the changes that occur within our bodies. Your lifelong sense of self is intimately tied to your body. But how much of that body stays with you for life? The answer is surprisingly little. If you live to be, say, 75 years old, the vast majority of your body will be younger than you are. The cells lining your gut, for example, are replaced about every 5 days. The outer layer of your skin turns over every 2 weeks, and you get a new set of blood cells every 4 months. That is not so surprising, given that these cells are on the front line of wear and tear. But the rest of your body also needs a refit from time to time. The average age of a bone cell is 10 years, a muscle cell 15 years, and a fat cell about 9.5 years. Your heart cells are on average 6 years younger than you. If you live beyond 50, about half the cells in your heart will have been replaced. The exception is your brain, most of which stays with you for your life. But renewal happens there too. There are cells in your cerebellum and hippocampus that are younger than you. Lawton's description of the changes that happen in a lifetime puts the idea of a fixed personal identity into perspective. Traditionally, in the teaching of psychology, images like this have been used to convey something about the inner workings of the brain. But we're not machines like this. Now, this image is more alluring. Its attractiveness comes from the way it captures the synchronized collective action of a dynamic system as it changes over time. Each of these waves could represent the rise and fall of probabilities of localized changes within the body. The image could even represent what is sometimes called the stream of consciousness. It was mentioned previously that your skin is not simply a barrier to the environment, but the point of contact with it. In view of this, the scientific endeavor becomes one of identifying how the kinds of changes portrayed here are related to environmental circumstances. The search for these functional relations, as they are called, is what drives the science of behavior analysis. But they're not always easy to identify. The challenge in finding them is typical of the sorts of challenges faced by scientists generally in the search for patterns in nature. Scientists function essentially as pattern detectives, and for many, this detective work is one of the main attractions of doing science. They use various tactics depending on the phenomenon being studied. When it comes to looking at changes in time, a simple tactic is to speed up time to see what happens, or to see what appears. In this example, traditional time-lapse photography provides us with insights into the patterning associated with changes that are localized in a particular kind of biological system, flower. A related strategy can be used when studying private events. Our starting point is to focus on the word experience. The original meaning of the word experience was to travel through. What a person travels through is a physical and social environment. We already know that genetic history sets limits on the kinds of changes that can take place within the body. And also, we know that changes that occur at any point in time are integrated with changes that have already taken place. We will use this animated character from the previous part of the tutorial to explore further.
You want another cup of tea or something?
Let's now take a closer look at how we might explore the experiences of our animated character. In this image, we see stretching across time the sequence of environments through which she travelled. What's particularly interesting here, though, is that this image is also relevant to you. You too experience these environments. This means that the animated character can be used to represent you. Admittedly, the experiences were very limited, and they involved mostly passive behaviour on your part. Nevertheless, you changed with each change of environment. This makes the discussion of private events more interesting now. Why? Well, if we're going to talk about private events, then it makes sense to involve your private events. So let's explore how your private events in this simple example might be dealt with by natural science of behaviour. When you first saw this character, you were asked to imagine that you could see all of the changes you might ever want to see inside a person. Now you're being asked to imagine that this is also you. This means you are in the privileged position of having two perspectives on your private events. One that is accessible only by you, and the corresponding alternative perspective of you as viewed by another person. If we animate the image, we can represent the complexity of your changes in each experience by changing the colors of the character. As the animation unfolds, remember that all of the changes build upon each other. This next animation takes a closer look at your changes. This time, in addition to changing colors, I have represented the complexity of the changes by simulating the dynamics within the body itself. But there is a problem with this animation. Take a look again at what is happening. As the animated character is changed through the interaction with the environment, or enters an experience, shall we say, the environment disappears and all you see are the changes. But only focusing on the changes is misleading. It could imply that one can understand changes in behaviour without looking at the context in which they occur. We need to remember that we are searching for functional relations between various categories of change and the environmental context that influences them. In this corrected animation, I have retained the functional relation between the changes in behaviour and the environment. Working with this image, we can say the following. Before you can have a complete understanding of those changes which define the behaviour of a person, you need to identify the environmental context influencing these changes. In these next few scenes, we see this lesson applied to a number of social situations with the aid of some additional animated figures. In each scene, we see first the behaviour of our main character, then the social context influencing this behaviour is revealed. And what is the behaviour of the main character? It is your behaviour in response to each of the smaller figures. Notice that whatever your response is to each of the small figures, at some point it involved the act of describing or interpreting, or as the scientists might say, labeling what you observed. Understanding the behavior of labeling and observation is central to any discussion on self-observation. This is because you must eventually ask the question, how did this behavior of labeling become part of my behavioral repertoire? Now, this might appear to be a rather odd question because surely, you might think, you use labels that fit with what you see the person doing. However, if I remind you that these animated figures are only collections of pixels on your computer screen, then your behavior of labeling needs to be viewed rather differently. In fact, it needs to be viewed simply as behavior that has been established so well it generalizes to a variety of situations. To say it more formally, what you see when you're observing the animated figure is the effects of stimulus control on your own thoughts. Here are some more opportunities for you to observe your labeling behavior. In each of these scenes, you'll find it difficult to suspend your labeling behavior, even though you're only looking at collections of pixels on the screen. Also, in these animations, I've introduced an extra observer. This makes the analysis of what is happening a lot more complicated, but also a lot more interesting. What we have then in these scenes is the following. From the perspective available only to you will see yourself labeling the behavior of the little figure. Because the central character is also you can see what the other observer would see if you both were collecting data on you from a so-called objective perspective, or as Skinner called it, the perspective of the other. As far as the second observer is concerned, you might infer that she too can view the scene from two perspectives. One where the central character is her, and one that is only accessible to her. And the dynamics of all of this complexity in detailing different perspectives is controlled by the presence of the little figure in the environment. This scene is particularly interesting because it shows the impact of your recent history of labeling. For someone new to this image, I suspect they would not have labeled it in the way you have just done. At this point, it would be helpful to review the main points we have addressed with the help of these animations. There are essentially two perspectives to consider when looking at private events. One of these is the perspective in which you are the observer. Then there is the perspective of someone observing you, or as Skinner called it, the perspective of the other. The perspective of the other is closely related to self-awareness. This is because it involves a shift in perspective in what you observe. As the term implies, it involves shifting to a perspective in which you observe yourself observing. This animation was intended to simulate this shift in that it views you from the perspective of the other. That is, it shows you how your observing behavior can be observed. A point to note is that for a behavior analyst, the language of shifting perspectives is very imprecise, because shifting perspectives simply means behaving differently. That said, it is possible to use both languages interchangeably, because most people understand that sometimes there is something to be gained from changing a routine behavior. Usually, a new perspective on things emerges. Now, once you acknowledge that your labeling behavior is simply a particular kind of behavior that is influenced by the environment, another question pops up. Where did this behavior come from in the first place? That's what we're going to examine next. Let's start with this animation. As in previous scenes, a little animated figure controls the labeling behavior of the observers. Imagine this time, though, that the scene takes place in another culture, and that the labeling behavior involves the use of this word. Framing the scene in a language that may be unfamiliar to you is a useful strategy. It helps to remove the influence that familiar words may have in your analysis, thus leaving you free to explore the answer to these questions. How did the central character come to label the behavior in this way? And the second question, does the little guy in green use the same label for his feelings? Of course, the simple answer to the first question is that she was taught to use these words. But that's too vague an answer for a scientist. We would need to know what actually happened in the teaching episode. Knowing these details is important for another reason. They would provide an insight into a fundamental issue hidden in the second question. Remember, the second question was the following: does the little guy in green use the same label for his feelings? Let's suppose he does use this label. What then is the hidden issue? B.F. Skinner drew attention to it by constructing a question concerning the development of a child's understanding of psychological terms. He said, "How is it possible to learn to refer to or describe things or events within our bodies, to which our teachers do not have access? How can they tell us that we are right or wrong when we describe them? In other words, how did the little green guy learn to label his feeling when only he can feel it?" In this animation, we see him in a social context where others can observe what he does. This scene is reminiscent of a scene earlier in the tutorial when we explored the term objectivity. The issue addressed now is related because it is his behaviour, as viewed by others, that leads them to provide an agreed label for what they observe. Indeed, this is the only perspective available to his parents, who might have used this word when they first saw him behave like this. As observers, parents can label a feeling for a child on the basis of at least three observations. Firstly, there is the learning history with which they might be familiar. They might know, for example, that he ate something recently which he hadn't eaten before. Secondly, parents will be acutely aware of what is happening in the current situation. That is, they will be observing his immediate interaction with the environment, and, for example, may have noticed him bumping into something. And their third aid to labeling feelings comes from a careful observation of his behaviour. This label, then, becomes the label he uses for the feelings only he has access to. Throughout this discussion on labeling private events, you must of course remember that there is always a scientific health warning, so to speak. Saying that someone is using a label for their private events mistakenly implies a duality where none exists. For example, it implies that there are two separate things. There is the person doing the labeling, and there is his private events. But there is only one whole organism that is behaving. The internal dynamics that have led to the production of the words should be viewed simply as characteristics of behaviour. To be more precise, words are to be viewed simply as sounds attached to changes in behaviour arising from interactions with the environment. Collectively, all of these behaviours, both internal and external, enter into relations with each other and with the environment. Back to the practicalities of how labels are taught. One problem with teaching labels, of course, is that the correlation between the feeling and the label is very imprecise. This image suggests, for example, that the observers have no way of knowing which of the variety of potential feelings is the one they are actually labeling. This might explain why oftentimes one word for thoughts or feelings doesn't really do justice to the varieties or complexities of those thoughts or feelings. That said, once the behaviour of labeling a feeling is established, we then have a basis for the experience of empathy when we observe the behaviour of others. The imprecision in teaching labels for some feelings is to be contrasted with other occasions where more precision is possible. This happens, for example, when a parent is teaching the labels for colours. Each colour produces its own change in private events, and because the stimuli are easily identified by all concerned, the labels for the colours would match the feelings precisely. And when a child uses the incorrect word for a colour, his behaviour can be corrected by his parents. Labels for other events or stimuli in the world are established in a similar fashion. To sum up this section on self-observation, I'll return to this image. Throughout the developmental process, there are limits for change that are imposed on our bodies by our genetic history. And through our experiences in the world, networks of relations develop between all forms of labeling within the behavioral stream. The end result is a rich tapestry of behaviours we call self-observation. In this tutorial, I have only scratched the surface of some of the many issues concerned with the study of private events. Although not addressed directly, many of these issues are central to our appreciation of what can be achieved in applied fields. To conclude then, I'll comment briefly on the practice of sharing the findings from applied research. In particular, I will draw attention to misunderstandings that can happen when students are not familiar with the need for scientific shorthand to communicate these findings. When scientists conduct their research, they develop specialized technical jargon that is essential for maintaining precision in their work. In this example, we see the abbreviations used by chemists for identifying the structure of chemical compounds. Imagine for a moment we wanted to communicate the results of a study conducted with this chemical sample. Usually, some sort of summary statistic would be used. In this instance, we draw a dot on a graph to represent the concentration level for each sample observation. In applied behavior analysis, you will find similar graphics used to communicate details about a behavior that is being studied. One disadvantage of doing so, however, is that a simple dot on a graph can appear cold and impersonal, and it seems to relegate the importance of private events for the person being studied. For the professional working with a person in the study, this couldn't be further from the truth. Another disadvantage of using a dot on a graph is that it doesn't do justice to a point made by Skinner when he said the following: "Behavior is a difficult subject matter, not because it is inaccessible, but because it is extremely complex. Since it is a process rather than a thing, it cannot be held still for observation. It is changing, fluid, evanescent, and for that reason it makes great technical demands upon the ingenuity and energy of the scientist." With a little imagination, it is possible to address the shorthand needed to communicate the effects on behavior of environmental manipulations and at the same time show the dramatic changes in the person. The private events of a person do not reveal themselves in dots on a graph, but a successful intervention will undoubtedly have had major effects on these private events. Perhaps someday we will have resources like this with which to teach. This image simulates the possibility of using a published research paper in which the data points are buttons that, when clicked, show all aspects of the behavior under investigation, including details of the intervention. Seeing the smile of a person who has benefited from a successful intervention can also do a lot to help promote the practice of an effective science.